Dave, it's that time. We can promise to all of our members, all of our listeners, that we will not make any more bad jokes for the rest of the year.
Starting right now, right?
Starting right now.
And on video. Because I can't promise I won't do that between now and New Year's. I just promise I won't do it on a podcast
on our
video.
podcast.
Yes.
We won't make any more bad jokes after this podcast for the rest of the year.
After this one.
Right. Because we're almost at the end of the year.
Yeah. It's been quite a year. I can't believe we're almost at 2022.
I saw a funny meme this morning that said the great problem with 2022 is when you say it, right, it can be 2022, 2022, but it can also mean 2022.
Right.
Right, TOO also. Like we're going to have to relive 2020. 2021 has been pretty sucky, and 2020 was sucky. I don't want to relive either of these years.
We said at the end of 2020, we said 2021 has got to be better.
Yeah.
And then we look back and we're looking at 2021. I don't know.
Yeah.
I do have a lot of optimism for 2022.
I do too.
I really do. That said, I have very little optimism that our progressive wannabe overlords are going to act any differently in 2022 than they've acted any time in the last 100 years.
Well, this brings up a very relevant subject since we're on the eve here of New Year's and everything that goes with it. It brings up the subject of resolve. That sort of depends on the resolve of the American people. I mean, you're right. Left to their own devices, our progressive overlords are going to keep doing what they have been doing in recent months and the last 2 years, and really what they do out of devotion to their cause, to progressivism. But they will change their behavior if we, the people, make them change their behavior, command them to change their behavior. Don't allow them anymore to continue doing what they're doing.
The last thing you just said is the most important. Don't allow them. Mm-hmm. Don't listen to them. Don't acknowledge them, right? They're not going to stop. This week we saw the latest example of the progressive overlords, I suppose, if that's what we're going to say, although I can't put her into this category as much as she wants to be. Jones, what's her name from the 1619 Project?
The wonderful Miss Hannah Nicole Jones.
Hannah Nicole Jones.
Yeah.
Hannah Nicole Jones was on one of the Sunday shows over the weekend,
yes.
National News, sitting there saying once again that parents should have no involvement in their children's education because they're not trained experts in education. So they can't know what a kid is supposed to learn, as well as the experts who Nicole Hannah Jones says have been trained in their field.
Right.
And I sat there and thought, wait a minute. I don't know very many high school history teachers who have history degrees. Most of them have degrees in education.
That's right. They've actually not been trained in their field. Yeah.
But they would like you to believe that. So the progressives are going to keep spouting their nonsense.
We're sitting here right near downtown Denver, Colorado, and in the Colorado State Legislature, this was not too long ago. Within the last year or two, one of our friends, it might be our friend Mark Baisley, I'm not sure, one of them captured on video in the state legislature. There was an education bill being debated and discussed. A bunch of parents had shown up to testify and express their concern. And this elected Democrat state legislator stood up and basically scolded the parents and said the same thing Hannah Nicole did. It was, think of the arrogance here in this attitude. This woman stood up and said, we, the legislators, the politicians, we can't trust you parents to decide how to educate your kids and what they're going to study in school, right? Because you're not the experts. For a lot of Americans, I think when they hear that kind of arrogance and dismissiveness of parents trying to raise and educate their children, for many Americans, it's sort of shocking. I can't believe that someone had that audacity to say that. For those of us who have studied the progressive idea, right, and the central tenets of progressivism and the trajectory of progress, it actually makes It makes perfect sense. That is part of progressivism, which is a scientifically managed, right, set regime of central planning where you have the supposed experts deciding everything up to and including, what kids are, what they're going to learn. By the way, I want to do a quick shout out. And I want to make it really clear to our listeners, there's no sponsorship involved here. No money has changed any hands. I just want to give a shout out to the good work of the American Institute for Economic Research,
right?
AIER, and in particular, one of their researchers, his name is Phil Magnus.
Yes.
He's a PhD in economics. He is doing yeoman's work. He has been on the 1619's trail like a bloodhound, and he's relentless. They just came out. The 1619 Project originally published a series of essays in the New York Times Magazine. There's the New York Times newspaper, and the New York Times also produces this magazine, and that was the home of the 1619 Project. Well, they collected all those essays, added some additional content, and just published all that in book form. So now you can get the 1619 Project book form, and Dr. Phil Magnus has already gone through it line by line, and he's made a list of all the earlier errors and lies and fabrications that they've covered up. They went through and covered and they've changed all these things, removed all these wrong assertions that were in their original published material. So I encourage, for anyone who understands what the 1619 Project is, follow the work of Phil Magnus at the American Institute of Economic Research, because he's just doing great. The patience that requires, right, to sit through and track down every scholarly reference, and that's the kind of work that he's doing.
You also shared on your Facebook page just about a week ago some of the published works of Dr. Magnus regarding COVID.
Yes.
So he's doing the same thing for COVID.
He is.
It's interesting in a way. We've actually been asked several times if there's a connection between us and Project Veritas.
Yes.
Right? And,
Yes.
and obviously we're not connected with Project Veritas.
Right.
But Project Veritas really goes after the politicians and the bureaucrats. What he is doing, what Dr. Magnus is doing is sort of taking the role of Project Veritas, but from an academic angle.
Yes.
He's looking at the academic research that's coming out that is incredibly misleading and incredibly manipulative. And he's trying to bring to light the truth of that. I do hope he gets the same recognition that some of the Project Veritas work gets as well.
He absolutely deserves. I mean, he's in a way, Project Veritas is sort of famous for they will infiltrate progressive groups and organizations, and they will catch progressives on recording, admitting things that they typically don't admit in public.
Sure.
What Dr. Magnus is doing is he's taking published statements and works and studies, and then he is showing all the errors. Magnus I believe, was the first one when COVID really started, when people started paying attention to it. This would have been February, March, April. Remember that weird spring of 2020? And this is as things gradually started shutting down. The NBA announced, no more games, and schools started closing. It was this process over a number of weeks. And the model for all that was this model that came out of Imperial College in England.
Right.
And it was based on old studies about variations of the flu. And Magnus went and he dissected their methodology, how they came. They were the ones predicting that. What did they predict? Something like 2 or 3 million Americans were going to die within a few months, right? These things. And he went in and showed how some of the basic assumptions were wildly off. Completely right. And he said the whole study, the whole conclusion for lockdowns is based on this study, and the study is based on these premises, these assumptions, which are stated within the study, and they're wrong. They're not actually correct. They even made some basic mathematical errors. And Magnus was, putting a spotlight on this. So he is doing some great, great scholarly work.
Is that possible? Can you make a mathematical error when your very premise is that math is racist? I mean,
it's a great question,
right? Like the
right?
1619 Project would argue back to Dr. Magnus.
Yeah.
We didn't make any mathematical errors. Your math is racist and therefore is not right.
Right. Your math. Hey, right, Dave. If we can have your truth and my truth and her truth, maybe we can have your math, my math, her math.
I mean, Common Core doesn't argue with that.
I wonder if the IRS would buy that. Hey, I don't really owe you. It's just my math is different from your math.
My math says you owe me $1 million.
Right.
I don't know what you're talking about. And if you tell me otherwise,
that's right.
You're racist.
That's right.
I'm not sure I'm ready to try that yet, but maybe one day.
If we have enough people, right?
Right.
That's the sort of thing that works. When you have enough people who are resolved to go up against some great challenge, great obstacle, and that's what we're going to be thinking about. That's what a lot of our members will be thinking about. That's what many fellow Americans are going to be thinking about. It's New Year's. People tend to do this at New Year's. They make resolutions. It's actually a practice that has a long, long history, and it's really interesting. This idea of we're starting a brand new year. It's sort of like the optimism many people have in the morning of a new day, right? It's a new day. I get to start a new day. I have 2 dogs, and the younger one, the puppy, she's a golden retriever. And when she wakes up in the morning, every single morning, she runs and grabs a toy, and she goes around the house to greet everyone, sort of crying with glee and happiness. She's just so happy that she gets to enjoy another day, right? And I'm here,
Absolutely.
And we're here, and it's wonderful. And New Year's is that same kind of spirit, but on a bigger, grander scale. It's not just a new day. It's a new year. And the question is, what is 2022 going to be like? And resolutions are a way of taking some responsibility, saying, I'm going to help shape this coming year to be the kind of year that I want it to be. I want to be the kind of person that I want to be in 2022. And we can also think about these in bigger social and political terms.
I think that's such an important framework to talk about when we really break down what are our resolutions. Nobody's saying what they are saying, I guess, the better way to approach it. They're saying by the end of 2022, by the end of the following year, here are the things I want to have achieved. Here are the things I want to have accomplished, overcome fears, challenges, struggles. These are things I've dealt with in the past that I'm going to do better in the coming year. And there probably isn't a better example for more Americans than their health, right? I mean, that's the number one thing you hear people talk about.
It's sort of the obvious. I'm going to lose some weight. I'm going to get in better shape. I'm going to stop smoking, right? Or stop drinking so much, things like that.
And what do we see? We see a rush on the gyms on January 1st every year.
Yep.
It'll be interesting to see how that works this year with COVID. That's been a big change. I bet you the home gym market is having a just boom this Christmas because people are sitting there saying, I need to start losing weight. I need to get back in shape. I need to be better about that. And they're all going to go buy it. And then what do we always see? We see these people who's committed to health. They either start smoking again in March or April or May. I'll just have one. I'll just have 2. I'll just have a pack. Or I'm going to go to the gym every day. And then it turns into 3 times a week, twice a week, once a month.
And very quickly they're right back into their old routines. Those resolutions, I want to make this point. It certainly is true that we human beings we're almost as good at breaking resolutions as we are making them, right? People in general break almost as many resolutions as they make. And yet that very idea of a resolution reflects something deeper, something more important. It reflects that very natural human desire to improve ourselves, improve the conditions around us, and to try to be devoted to it, right? To say, I am determined, I am committed, I'm devoted, I'm resolved to make this thing happen. And when people stick with their resolutions, when they're actually successful, It's a beautiful, noble thing
Absolutely.
to see. It's interesting, that notion of resolutions, that idea of being resolved. It shows up in many like official statements and proclamations, many laws. Immediately coming to my mind during the great heated political controversies of the 1790s during the administration of John Adams, when, I mean, the politics got very ugly, very rough and tumble, very quickly in American history. Jefferson and Madison go and write these state resolutions, the Kentucky resolutions, the Virginia resolutions. And in fact, they're structured in a way, every big main section begins resolved, right? Here are the things we're going to do, or here are the things that we are devoting ourselves to. And that idea of resolution, therefore, reflects something deeper if we take it seriously. In fact, we could make the argument, I would make the argument, the United States began with a kind of resolution, a deadly serious resolution, our own Declaration of Independence.
Absolutely. I mean, the Declaration in of itself, we've talked about this. If anybody wants to really dig into it, our American Idea Toolbox, one of the first videos, it's in our very first seminar on the website, talks all about how they started here. These founders admitted they're imperfect people, and they wanted to achieve something perfect. And their goal was, it might not happen in their lifetime, it might not happen, but they were setting a resolution for America. And they were making a long-term resolution for America. I think you said something else earlier that really triggered a thought as you were talking about sort of the historical sense of resolutions and that they've been around for so long. It's also what separates us as human beings. It's what makes us unique as human beings. We've talked at length about this idea of reason and humans' ability to use reason as opposed to instinct and find that common ground and decide what instincts do I follow and what do I need to suppress, right? Your self-restraint versus your and it's such a core fundamental piece of these resolutions. You don't see animals sitting there, right? Your golden retriever is not going to wake up on New Year's Day and say, you know what? I'm resolved to find a new toy every day that I'm going to bring around the house. I'm resolved to...
Well, if you ever do see an animal doing it, it's a very funny thing. There was a great animated movie. I'm getting old, so this is now... You remember the movie Finding Nemo?
Sure. And
in Finding Nemo, the big, great white shark, he's going to counseling. He thinks eating fish is a problem. So he's resolved to try to not eat fish. But then the moment he smells a little blood in the water, that shark is
that instinct.
And that's a comedy. That's ridiculous, right? Sharks don't do that. So you're right. It is only rational creatures with a free mind who can think and make choices for themselves are capable of making resolutions. It is an eminently human thing to do.
And we use our reason, and we have to decide which of our instincts are good, which of our instincts do we want to let just sort of work, and which of our instincts do we want to repress, which of our instincts do we want to control that make us good human beings. And that sort of sets that framework, and it set the framework for the Declaration of Independence. It set the framework for what America was designed to become.
Well, and I wanted to add a note on that. I mentioned this in our Toolbox video on the American Idea, but I wanted to reinforce it here. The Declaration is a fascinating document for many reasons, among which is it is simultaneously a statement of self-evident truths. It offers observations and insights into things that actually are true, such as the fact that every human being does, in fact, truly have a natural right to their own life, their own liberty, their own pursuit of happiness. And if anyone is violating it, whether it's a government or individuals, that's wrong. It's wrong. Everyone really does have those rights. That's a statement of moral and political truth, of facts. And simultaneously, it's an aspirational document. It's also saying, now, based on those truths, here's how we should be living. Here's how government ought to operate. It should offer equal protection of the laws for the equal rights of all the citizens. It should be based on the consent of the government. So it's aspirational at the same time. And that's where resolutions come in. It's not merely a choice, it's a serious choice, right? It's a choice that we want to enshrine in a resolution and be resolved to try to actually carry through with this thing. I was reminded a couple of great, just wonderful statements about what a resolution is, helping us understand resolutions. Like I said, many of the documents of the American Revolution and many famous documents going back long before are written in the form of resolutions. You have a long history. When you were younger, you were involved in debate.
Right.
And many forms of debate. Well, the debate centers around a resolution, right? Resolve, so some kind of statement.
Well, what's interesting about it is when you go into a debate, it's never just a question, right? They don't go into we didn't go into a debate with a should this be the case or should what should be right or what should be how should we do this? It was always be it resolved. An individual should, or the United States should, or citizens should. And it says they're making a statement. And somebody has to argue in favor of that statement, and somebody has to argue against that statement. But they're saying, here's a statement, here's a resolution. Do we think this is a resolution is good or is it bad?
Right.
It's no different probably than the conversations that were happening when the Declaration was written. Is this the right resolution?
Yeah.
And you tweak language and it's kind of interesting because you get into these conversations about very specific words, right? I think about you probably wrote a lot of true-false quizzes in your life.
Right, yes.
Right?
Yes.
And one of the tricks that a lot of teachers and professors use on true-false questions is everything will be good except for one word.
Right.
and that one word is just throws the whole thing off. And,
Yes.
and so that was a key part of a resolution. Your resolution has to be not only something meaningful and something thoughtful and reasonable and everything else, but you got to be careful not to throw something extra in. Right? You can't say in your health resolution, I'm going to quit smoking and my health is going to be better, but I'm going to allow myself 15 cigarettes a day. Like that's not a resolution. You've got to make a resolution and decide, is this something I can achieve?
Yeah, it should be precise, right? You should have some precision about your language, make it accurate, make it well defined, the terms. I was reading through, so for our members here, I'll hold this up. This is Ben Franklin's autobiography. Ben Franklin, of course, is our motif at the Vino Veritas Society. And in the middle here, he has this just wonderful little section where he's talking about this period in his life as a young man. Now, a great theme throughout Franklin's life is the idea of self-improvement, always trying to really challenging yourself in every way, physically, mentally, intellectually, morally, just what can you do to improve your life, improve your situation, improve your station in the world? And he says, and I'm going to read just a couple of lines. He says, it was about this time I conceived the bold and arduous project of attempting to arrive at moral perfection. That was his goal. He said, I wished to live without committing any fault at any time. I would conquer all that either natural inclination, like appetites and instincts, custom or company might lead me into. I did not see why I might not always do the one and avoid the other. But then he goes on and he says he soon found out that task was moral perfection was something he was incapable of. So what he did to help as an exercise is he was reading all these great books of moral philosophy. Of course, he was, reading the Bible and religious texts, and he was reading Aristotle and Cicero. And he decided to try to take all that wisdom and insight and compress it down into his own short list of virtues. And he ends up with 13. And they're listed here in his autobiography. And the idea of resolution, being resolved, is one of his virtues. And here's how Ben Franklin defines what that means to a resolution. Quote, resolve to perform what you ought, perform without failure what you resolve. It's just absolutely gorgeous, right? So you figure out what you ought to do? What is the right thing to do? And make a resolution. You're going to do that. And then go do it, right? Actually perform it. Don't just say the words. Don't just make the commitment. I also have in front of me, I jotted down the last line of the words are so wonderful. I wanted to make sure I didn't make a mistake. That notion of resolution, of being resolved, is in the culminating, really climactic sentence of the most famous political speech, I would argue the most famous political speech, certainly in American history and probably in all of human history, Lincoln's remarks at Gettysburg.
Right.
And there he is, of course. The whole purpose of that ceremony was to dedicate a cemetery. There had been a horrific battle in the summer in July of 1863, 50,000 men slaughtered. And one of the great challenges at Gettysburg was trying to bury all the dead. I mean, there are all these corpses, and not just human beings. I mean, dead horses and cows and, right? Cannon shells don't discriminate, right? They just tear apart everything that they hit. And they had tried like digging trenches and covering them up with dirt. It wasn't working. So they commissioned someone to design an actual cemetery and bury all the dead properly as they should. And it's an ancient practice to dedicate a cemetery. Lincoln came. It's funny, that was sort of an afterthought to invite the President of the United States. People forget how close Washington, D.C. is not that far, maybe 80, 90 miles from Gettysburg. Mm-hmm. And the main speaker was a fellow named Edward Everett, who was a famous politician. He was president of Harvard University. He spoke for over 2 hours. Nobody knows it. Nobody remembers anything that he said. And then Lincoln stood up and said 272 words, and the whole world remembers, to this day, the Gettysburg Address. And one of the features, I've taught entire seminars on the Gettysburg, there's much to talk about. One of the features of that little speech is what he does with the word dedication, dedicate. We're here to dedicate this cemetery, this final resting place. But then he turns that meaning of dedicate to the living. He says the real work is for us to be dedicated, right? Not to dedicate this. They're all dead. They're done. They can't do anymore. We, the living, we still have a lot of work to do, and we should be dedicated, right? Devoted, committed, resolved to carry on the good work that they were doing.
Dedicated to the proposition that, right?
That's right.
That is the essence of the very beginning of the Gettysburg Address. We are dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
All men are created equal.
And that's the argument, right? If you go back to the debate argument, that would be a debate topic.
Right.
Resolved. We are dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
Right.
Debate.
Right. And so at the very end, this is how Lincoln concludes his famous address. He says that we here highly resolve. There's that notion of being resolved. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. And whether they died in vain or not is kind of up to us, the living. It depends on what we do with it. They died trying to make America a land of freedom and get rid of slavery. Whether they died in vain or not is up to us, the living, to carry on and actually finish that work. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. I love that way of enshrining the idea of resolution, of being resolved in the most famous speech in our own history, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address.
You know, there's a really interesting juxtaposition between that and Franklin's discussion about resolution. Mm-hmm. Both equally important, but yet both very, very different in purpose. Franklin was talking about himself. He was talking about he as an individual. What are his resolutions? How do you be resolved yourself? Lincoln is trying to inspire others to be resolved towards something that he believes in, right? And that juxtaposition is so important because we go back to the Declaration. The Declaration wasn't a resolution that those 56 men themselves were going to be resolved to live a certain way. They were making a resolution for all Americans,
Yes.
for everybody to,
Yes.
to live in a certain way, and knew the requirement. That's why Franklin said later, a republic if you can keep it, right? He again was encouraging, we resolved to form a republic. We resolved to form a constitutional republic where all men are created equal and we recognize self-evident truth and everything else. It's a very different approach. And I think as we get to New Year's and as we think about our resolutions, the most common resolutions, I think today, especially more than ever, we're talking about ourselves. I want to be more healthy.
Right.
I'm going to do better at work. I'm going to make more friends. I'm going to, whatever it might be.
It's personal.
But how many people are out there making resolutions for their community, for their family, for their nation?
And here, Dave, you touched on something that it really is. It's fundamental. When you keep pulling on these strings, you end up at a classical problem. This is a central theme in classical philosophy. Plato, Aristotle, later thinkers. In a way, I would describe it as, the way Leo Strauss described this as the fundamental political problem. And that is, the political problem is the fact that human beings are these complex beings. On the one hand, they have self-interest, self-awareness, self-consciousness, right? Each of us are aware that we are a self, and there are things that we want, there are things that are good for us, there are things we should do, all of that. We have our interests. And at the same time, we're social and political beings.
Right.
We live with other people. We live under laws. We live under governments that affect all of us. And so we're always, there's this kind of tension between, do I just pursue what's good for me, or do I think about the political community? We have a case study on citizenship. I'm sorry, not a case study, a seminar within the academy. And it's kind of a challenge. It's a challenge. It challenges Americans to think about themselves, not just as an individual, but also as a citizen of a political community, the United States. And what do you think about your country, your nation today? Is your government a just government? Is it a constitutional government? Does it do the things that we the people authorized it to do? Does it do things we the people did not authorize it to do? Do those in government use their powers to protect the rights of citizens or to violate the rights of citizens, right? And whatever the answers are, if something needs to be done, if we need some improvements, changes, tweaks, adjustments, what can we as citizens actually do about that? That's thinking about our own interest in a bigger political context of our nation. And that's really the difference between Franklin is talking about, for the most part, right, resolution in a very personal, individual. What's good for you, and make sure that you go do those things that are good for you. Lincoln is saying, think about your nation. Think about the laws because we are citizen legislators. Well, in many states, at the state level, we sometimes directly make law. We vote for initiatives that become laws. And even at the national level, we vote for members of Congress. We vote for presidents who then make laws. We're ultimately authorizing the laws that they make.
Or at some point, I mean, it becomes even more direct if they're trying to amend the Constitution. It does come to us to actually approve on an individual basis.
And so as a citizen, if we're to take that role seriously, what does it mean to be a citizen? What does citizenship mean? It requires that we think about not only what's good for us individually, and we should think about that, beginning with basic things like what's good for my health, what's good for my safety, also what's good for my character. This leads into the virtues that we talk about. We should exercise those virtues as individuals, but we should also be thinking in a bigger, broader kind of way. We are all authorizing, directly or indirectly, the laws that affect us and affect all other citizens. Even if you ignore elections and you ignore what state legislatures and Congress does, you are influencing, you're helping to allow bad people pass bad laws. You're not stopping them, right? So no matter what you do as a citizen, even if you do nothing, you're doing something.
Sure.
Your actions or inactions have some kind of impact. And so this notion of resolution, I mentioned Lincoln to think about, how do we think about this as citizens? What exactly can we do? And we'll get into that a little bit later in our discussion. And there's another aspect to this. I mentioned before how you brought up this notion that leads us into the really deep waters in classical political philosophy, the tension between the individual and the political community. And there's another piece to this notion of resolution. You mentioned before how it's a really human, it's part of our human nature. It's part of what makes us human, that capacity to make resolutions. And I want to shine a little bit of a light on that and dive into those waters just a little bit here, because in a way it's the fundamental basic question of the modern world. Are human beings actually free? Now, this was a question that in the classical world, it wasn't a great controversy, because most of the great classical thinkers said, yeah, of course, each of us as a human being, we experience our own freedom. We experience the fact that we can make choices, right? We can reason about things, make judgments, make choices. Of course, we're free beings. But a big piece of the modern story, the modern turn, and this leads to things like communism and socialism and other versions of progressivism. The turn in modern science, and here I mean modern technological science, the scientific revolution that begins with thinkers like Francis Bacon, René Descartes, really the kind of basis of modern mathematical physics and chemistry. The premise of that is that the entire world, everything that is real, is material, is matter, is physical. Whether it's molecules or atoms, whatever. They weren't sure what the smallest piece of matter was, but whatever that is, that's all that's real.
Right.
Reality doesn't include other things. Well, matter is not free. Matter is a slave to the laws of physics, to gravity, right? And whatever other forces, electromagnetic forces there are in nature. Then comes along thinkers like Karl Marx, who says, okay, I've learned from modern science that the only reality is material reality, matter. A thoughtful Marxist will say, I'm a materialist. Anything that's not physical matter isn't real. Well, that means they deny things like the metaphysical freedom of the mind.
Sure.
Or the idea of a soul, right? The soul is not a piece of matter. It can't be cut up with a pair of scissors, right? Or it's not material.
Well, I think that was a major change in thinking, and we've seen that especially today. This change in when people talk about the soul today, or even more importantly, when you look back at like the old Saturday morning cartoons, right?
Yeah.
There was a time, you look back at the time of Aristotle, before, after, just after. The soul was never something that was looked at as something physical. It wasn't. Right. It wasn't something you could see, you could touch, you could feel. It was as another person. Right. Then we start seeing this change that, well, the soul must be material. If there is a soul, it is matter. And that's when you start getting the cartoons where somebody gets killed, a cartoon gets killed, and you see the soul float out of the body, right? It is now a physical component that can take shape and be seen and everything else. And I think to an extent, I don't know when that transition took place. You probably could pinpoint it a little bit better than I can, but it's become almost everyday practice, even for those who fully believe in the soul and the idea of the soul from a spiritual standpoint, still think about it as it's a piece of matter inside of you that somehow escapes when you die.
I think you're right. In a way, this whole question whether there is anything other than matter, it's core, it's foundational in that virtually all of our other interesting philosophic, political debates flow from it. If there is something in the world that is immaterial, that is metaphysical, that's not pure matter, like a soul, that means it's always a possibility there could be an immaterial God. all these things are possibilities according to the classical view. But according to the modern technological science, if all reality is matter, then something like an immaterial God, by definition, is not real.
Right.
It's just nothing but an illusion or a myth or a lie, but it's not something. It's not something real. This is a shorthand summary. It's also large. It's fairly accurate. Really, when you look through the history of classical philosophy, and as that narrows into modern technological science, in the literature you find thinkers used to refer to the soul, and then they start referring to mind, and then eventually they refer to brain. This is just the brain, because the brain is something you can look at, cut into, analyze, right? The word analyze, the Greek root of the word analyze is to take apart. Something you can, to analyze, and it means something you can take apart. Of course, that raises the whole question, but how can you see the fullness, the wholeness of a thing, right? Seeing the wholeness of a thing is different than taking it apart and seeing the parts. But here's the big point I want to get at. That classical view, which was the view the founders had, is that there is something free about the human being, within the human being. The metaphysical freedom of the mind is the source of our freedom. It's that thing within us that is not a slave to gravity, because it's not material. It's the thing that by which we can think and reason and judge and choose. And for those of us who believe there's something metaphysically free within us, we always have reason to be optimistic. We always have reason to be hopeful, because as long as we are free to make choices, it means the future is not determined. It's not, history doesn't determine it. Nothing else determines it. It means we are always free to make choices, and to make different choices than we've been making, and blaze a new path, or correct and reform some wrongs that have been done, make things better than we are. It means resolutions are always a possibility if we make a choice and dedicate ourselves to the resolutions. The view of modern scientific technology, and I want to be really clear about this. This is what makes this so difficult. Modern scientific technology has indeed produced many wonderful things. We're sitting here talking on, right, microphones and recording videos that are going to be, shown beamed through the internet, and people are going to watch them on their computers.
And even more simply, we had a light switch that we could turn on and actually see lights.
Yes.
We didn't have to come in here and create fire so that people could actually see us.
So I don't want to be mistaken, and I don't want someone to think, oh, well, Krennewer thinks all of modern scientific technology is bad or right. I'm not saying it's bad. It's bad. Here's what I'm saying. There is a premise to it. And the premise, on the one hand, leads to light switches and computers and everything, great medical devices and other things. But it also leads to things like communism. It leads to the thought of Karl Marx. Marx was a deep student of modern science. He understood the scientific revolution. He understood Francis Bacon and René Descartes and these other great modern scientific minds. And he was persuaded that the only reality is material reality, matter, that there really is no metaphysical freedom to the human mind.
Sure.
And as my teacher, Harry Jaffa, loved to say and write, he wrote this on many occasions, it's a short step from denying the freedom of the mind to denying political freedom to human beings. If they really don't have minds, then we simply shape various institutions and ways of living that they're going to live. And those who believe that we're not free, or that we can't do much of our freedom with our freedom, they tend to have a kind of fatalistic view.
Sure.
A sort of, well, they're resigned, they're consigned to the, yes, we're living as slaves, or yes, we're living under this terrible tyrant, but what can we do about it? There's nothing we can do. Versus the view of someone who really appreciates and values the freedom of the mind, says, we don't have to live like this. We have free minds. We can make choices and change things.
I think there's also a twist on that, 180 degrees from that. that is just as concerning. And you saw it in the early writings of the progressives right around the turn of the 20th century. Early Woodrow Wilson, John Dewey, you saw them talking about, they believed that the science said that this person's mind, because they are black or they are or a woman or anything else, they would sit and say, the science tells us their brains aren't capable of as much as mine, and therefore they are not capable of living freely. They are not capable of that freedom of the mind.
Here, let's make it really clear. According to that progressive view, if you are the natural superior to me because of your skin color or whatever else, if you're the natural superior to me, then you're the natural ruler over me. I should be enslaved by you. It is according to nature then, on that premise, that you enslave me.
The other thing that you were talking about that really struck me was, we talk about things and they talk about things as everything is material, and everything, if everything is science and always happens based on our interaction with it, right? We control everything, because if I do this, I just hit a bunch of atoms that are or molecules that are floating through the air, and they all went in different directions, right? And they all did what they will always do when I push a bunch of
the example I like to use, the materialist view of the world is like looking at the whole world as a gigantic billiard ball table.
Exactly.
All they're billiard balls, and just like you can measure and predict if you hit one pool ball with another, and you know the velocity and the weight, right, and all you know exactly where the second ball is going to go. Well, now take that image and expand it to the whole world. It's just matter in motion, things bumping into each other. But what's going to happen has all been determined by the laws of gravity and physics.
Well, but that's where the metaphysical has to come in. There are those aspects that we never have control of, we don't understand, and they came in and they exist perfectly, right? You look at something like gravity. Gravity exists perfectly, and nobody really thinks about that. If gravity was a fraction of a percent stronger, I mean, we don't really appreciate how strong or how exact gravity is.
Right.
If it was a fraction of a percent stronger,
right,
we would get crushed.
Right.
If it was a fraction of a percent lighter, we would float off into space.
Right.
But gravity is precise. It is right there. And there has never been a human who's had any control over that. And so there has to be something metaphysical about gravity.
Well, I'll give you another example that was the example that really attracted the interest of Leo Strauss for most of his adult life, and that was the operations of the mind itself. Here I am, a being with a mind, and suppose I ask the question, how does my own mind work? And suppose I explain the operations of my own mind. I say, well, according to this mathematical formula, right, that takes into consideration all these laws of physics and gravity and everything else, and there are, atoms and molecules bumping around in here. What I've just done is I've explained away the freedom of my own mind, and yet didn't I freely choose to study my own mind? Not everyone studies their right. I made that choice, and so of course there are not everything in the world can be reduced to observable, measurable, predictable matter. Starting with the closest thing we have to study, which is our own mind. We don't even have to travel into space to find things we can't fully understand. We can't fully understand ourselves precisely because there's a freedom within our own mind. There's something within us that cannot be explained fully in terms of cause and effect, physical cause and effect. Our own mind, our own soul. That's both the source of great mystery. What is the soul? How does it operate? What does it mean? There never will be a definitive explanation for that. And it's also a source for great hope and optimism, because it means we really are free creatures. Even if we're suffering terrible political tyranny, even if someone has thrown us in a cage or has put us in chains, the one thing they can't stop, as long as we're alive, It can't stop our mind from thinking freely. It can't control our mind. And minds that can think, one of the great themes in modern scholarship is that history is this great, is not just dates and names from the past, but that history is this shaping force. It's like a river cutting through, valleys and shaping, something like the Grand Canyon, right? It was really cut out by that. History shapes and moves and forms, and what we are today is the result of all the history that has preceded us, and there's nothing we can do about it. History does what history does, and it produces various results. And yet, think of moments where all the historical momentum seems to be going one way, like the British Empire taking control effectively of the entire world. After they beat the French, they have colonies around the globe. They have the greatest navy they can project power anywhere they want to go. It seems that their total global dominance is inevitable, predetermined, irresistible, can't be changed or challenged until you get this scrappy little band of rebels in North America, chief among them, George Washington, who say, no, you're not going to rule us without our consent. You're not taking our taxes if we're not actually represented in your government. And they make a choice and they fight back and they change the course of history. Or think of that perilous moment where just as Winston Churchill is elected prime minister in England and Nazi Germany seems unstoppable. I mean, they're smart. The Germans are smart. Germans have the greatest university system in the world, and they've trained the greatest engineers, and they have the best tanks and fighter planes. They were right on the verge. They were leading the way in terms of rocket technology. They had the most advanced rockets. They were trying to dial them in. They would either shoot too far or not far enough, but they were close to solving those problems. And it just seems like there's nothing that can possibly stop the rule of Nazi Germany over the rest of the world. And along comes Winston, this little lisping, fat, bald, right Englishman, Winston Churchill, who says, no, you're not going to do this. And I am resolved. I am going to stay focused on this effort to stop the Nazis from ruling our nation. And we're going to fight anywhere that we have to fight. And he was not only resolved, he inspired resolution in his fellow citizens. And that's that kind of optimism that free people have. We're not slavish. We're not fatalists. We know that we have free minds and can make choices.
I'm going to make the argument that what you just said right there, that optimism is still core. A lot of people who are sitting out there saying, yeah, but look at the country and look at everything's going. And it's so hard to be optimistic. And do people really care? And all of those questions. And then I sit back and I think, look at the movies. At the end of the day, Americans still cheer on the guy who changes the course of history.
Yeah, that's right.
In every movie, whether it's in Indiana Jones or whatever, these movies, people are still cheering on. The hero is still the guy who says, you can't do that to me.
That's right.
You can't bind me. You can't control me. You can't enslave me. I'm going to fight back. And I'm going to change the direction of the country. It's why still this fight over who Lincoln belongs to, right? This totally improper fight, this huge myth that the left has created that Lincoln would be a progressive.
Right.
Why do they do that? Because Lincoln changed the course of history.
That's right.
And they want that mantle.
That's right.
They want to be able to claim that. People still love that. And at some point, history is going to look back. I believe this, that if we keep fighting, if we become good guardians of the American idea, we're going to look back at history and say, there was a group of people who turned the tides of that American progressive wave.
Some of the greatest stories in all of history, I'm thinking of the story of Moses, right? How tempting must it have been Moses wasn't in Egypt.
Right.
He was out of Egypt. Now, bad things were happening in Egypt, but how convenient would it have been for Moses to say, I'm going to sit this one out. I'm just going to stay here and tend to my sheep, right? And no, I'm not going. I don't want to go back there. I know what Egypt's like. I got out. I'm not going back there. That would have been really, really easy. Instead, and think of how much momentum Egypt had. Think of what Egypt meant in the days of Moses. Egypt was the most powerful, sophisticated, totalitarian regime in the world. And here's this guy, and he has this broken down old donkey, and he decides to start right ahead. I'm going to Egypt. I'm going to go free the Jews.
Right.
And it seems impossible, and yet he is resolved. There is a resolution in him, and he doesn't waver, and he sticks to it, and he changes the course of history. And so members of the Vino Veritas Society who really do believe in the precepts and the virtues, who believe in the American idea, the principles of the American founding, that means we believe the human mind is always free, and we're not destined to any kind of miserable, tyrannical, progressive future. We can change things if we want to. And I think one of the most important things we need to talk about is the question, so what should we resolve to do? What should our resolutions be as individuals, as citizens, as members of the Vino Veritas Society? And I got a feeling we're not going to be able to get to that in this podcast.
No, we can keep going next week. It'll be kind of nice once before New Year's and once after. I think what you said is really important. And when you talk about free mind, I think it's important for us to remember that everybody else who doesn't agree with you, they have a free mind too, whether they know it or not, whether they choose to use it or not, they have a free mind. The question is, how are you going to approach them? Kind of throws me back to one of our earlier podcasts where you used one of Jaffa's favorite sayings, you can't beat a dogma with a stigma.
Right.
What is the best way to start changing the free minds of other people?
Yeah.
To start getting them to believe that they have a free mind and encouraging them to use it, and not just letting them think that, well, I'm not an expert. And the progressives are telling me that if I'm not an expert, I shouldn't have an opinion on this. I shouldn't be involved in this decision. I should just do whatever they say. And I think to that point, the challenge that I would issue to our members over the next week until they hear our next podcast, it'll also be a major part of the upcoming case study for January, is you're going to have your Franklin-like resolutions, your personal individual resolutions, and think about what are those things for you, and you're going to be resolved to do them and follow through. At the same time, think about your Lincoln-style resolutions, your founders' resolutions.
Maybe even call them your patriotic resolutions. Right. As a patriot, as a citizen, what would you resolve to do?
Your social and political resolutions, as you've talked about.
Yeah.
And what is it that you think can be done in the next year, in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years? And what are the steps you're going to take to do it? And how are you going to sell it? I think that's the most important thing. What we saw with the Declaration, the founders sold the Declaration. They wrote it in a way, they didn't just say, we're out. We're resolved to push the British back to the island of the United Kingdom and get away from us. They actually wrote it in a way to sell it. At the same time, Lincoln at Gettysburg wrote it in a way to sell it to people. How are you going to sell it? It's an act of branding. It's an act of marketing.
And I want to reiterate a point you just made. As our members think about how to communicate, how to brand, how to market, realize that many of our fellow citizens who pride themselves on progressives, they have this, for many of them, it's an unspoken assumption. In fact, for many of them, it's an assumption they really haven't thought through, but at some level, they really do deny the freedom of their own mind. They think, they buy into a large extent, the whole world is just matter and everything can be explained by physics. And yet the truth is, they do have a free mind. They deny they have a free mind, and yet they have a free mind. That's part of the audience we're trying to communicate with and persuade and inspire. How do you do that? How do you approach someone with a free mind who denies the freedom of their own mind?
Right. So I think putting that challenge out there, it's not going to be an easy thing to think through, and I think it's going to take work. I hope they'll do it together. I think it's a better conversation to have with friends, especially thoughtful friends.
For our members who are in chapters, great chapter conversation right there.
Great chapter conversation. It will be part of the case study. And for those who are not part of chapters, for those, go into the forum section of our website and start having that conversation there too. There's going to be a lot of ways to do that.
Well, Dave, we just went through a whole podcast and we didn't even talk about our new website, the new platform. So I'll just throw in, we have launched something beautiful, and we really are upping our game and creating a kind of online platform that offers so many different kinds of experiences for our members. I encourage, if anyone has not logged in recently, they should. I guess if they're listening to this podcast, that means they're logged into the website.
So if you've listened all the way through the podcast, we're done. Take a look around, spend some time and think about it or comment on this and let's start the conversation. This is only going to improve, and these resolutions as a political and social community are only going to happen if we do it together.
Till next time.
Nos somos custodios.